I've been watching this situation for 24 hours straight, and I want to walk you through everything that happened today, because what unfolded between Sunday night and Monday morning is one of the most revealing sequences I've seen in years of tracking how American foreign policy actually works versus how it gets described on television. On Saturday, Trump posted a 48-hour ultimatum on Truth Social, threatening to obliterate Iran's power plants if the Strait of Hormuz wasn't fully reopened. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded by threatening to destroy every energy facility and desalination plant across the Gulf. Oil hit $114 a barrel. The 48-hour clock was ticking. Everyone was bracing for Monday evening, when the deadline expired and the strikes were supposed to begin. Then Monday morning arrived, and Trump posted again. He said the United States and Iran had, over the last 2 days, very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of hostilities. He said his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff had met Sunday evening with a top Iranian official. He said Iran wants very much to make a deal. He announced he was postponing all military strikes on Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for 5 days while negotiations continue. Oil dropped 14% in a matter of minutes. Stock futures soared. Wall Street celebrated. And then, less than 1 hour later, Iran's foreign ministry posted a statement that said there are no talks between Tehran and Washington, that no negotiations have taken place and none are underway, and that Trump's announcement was, in their words, psychological warfare designed to manipulate financial and oil markets and escape the quagmire in which the U.S. and Israel are trapped. So on the same Monday morning, Trump announced a breakthrough deal. Iran announced there was no deal. Oil swung 14% in one direction, then clawed back. Sirens went off in Bahrain shortly after Trump's announcement. Lebanese health officials reported 10 people killed over the previous 24 hours, and the 48-hour ultimatum that was supposed to define American resolve simply expired, replaced by a 5-day pause that Iran publicly rejected the existence of. I've spent over a decade analyzing how governments use information in conflict, and what I watched today was something specific. It wasn't diplomacy. It was a president using a social media post to move an oil price. Bloomberg described it precisely. They said it almost didn't matter that less than an hour later, Iran contradicted Trump's claim, because the message to Wall Street was clear. Trump, at least, is eager to end a war that has sent the global economy careening toward crisis since he started it 3 weeks ago. Read that again carefully. The market rally happened not because the war ended, not because a deal was signed, not because Iran confirmed a single thing. It happened because markets concluded that Trump is scared of what he started. That is not a sign of strength. That is a market pricing in the probability that the president who issued the ultimatum doesn't actually want to follow through on it. The rally was not confidence in American resolve. It was confidence that American resolve has a ceiling, and that ceiling just became visible. Now let me zoom out and show you the full picture of what has happened over the last 3 weeks, because today's events only make sense if you understand the sequence that led here. Trump launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, promising a short, decisive military campaign with clear objectives. 24 days later, here is where things actually stand. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed to American allies. Iran is running a selective checkpoint, allowing China, India, and neutral countries through while blocking U.S.-aligned shipping. The 48-hour ultimatum has come and gone with no strikes. The strikes have been postponed 5 days. Iran says there are no negotiations. Trump says there are negotiations. Oil is still 40% above where it was on February 27th, even after today's 14% drop. The Federal Reserve still cannot cut rates because inflation is being driven by an energy shock with no clear endpoint. And the Trump-Xi summit that was scheduled for March 31st in Beijing has been delayed by a month because Trump said, and I'm quoting directly, "We got a war going on. I think it's important that I be here." That last point is more significant than it sounds. Let me explain why. Before this war started, Trump had one major diplomatic achievement scheduled that he could point to as proof that his confrontational approach to China was working. The Beijing summit, the deal framework, the soybean purchases, the managed trade agreement, the idea that he could stare down China through tariffs and then fly to Beijing in triumph and get Xi to buy American goods on American terms. That was the story. That was the headline he wanted coming out of spring 2026. That story is now delayed by a month, happening under completely different conditions, and the dynamics have shifted against him in ways that are worth understanding precisely. I've been going through every analytical piece published on the Beijing summit over the past week, and the picture that emerges is consistent across sources that don't normally agree. Before the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs on February 20th, Trump was going into Beijing with tariff pressure as his primary leverage. The implicit threat was, buy our goods, make concessions, or I escalate the tariffs. China was responding to that threat. Soybean purchases were being made. Rare earth flows were partially restored. The October 2025 Busan truce was holding. Then the Supreme Court ruled the tariffs unconstitutional. Dan Wang, China director at the Eurasia Group, said it directly. The ruling limits Trump's ability to deploy tariffs at will and reduces pressure on Beijing to expand soybean purchases or ease rare earth access. A former U.S. trade representative said Trump had effectively had his wings clipped on his signature economic policy. The primary weapon going into the Beijing negotiation was legally invalidated 6 weeks before the meeting. And then the Iran war started, and the Tehran summit that was supposed to demonstrate American strength became a war that America cannot end on its own terms. And the Beijing summit that was supposed to demonstrate American economic leverage became a meeting where Trump arrives, having lost his tariff authority in the Supreme Court, having burned through roughly half his precision munitions inventory in a conflict with no exit plan, having delayed the summit because he got, in his own words, a war going on, and sitting across from Xi Jinping, who has been watching all of this happen from a position of strategic patience that the Atlantic Council's Melanie Hart described plainly. She said there is still no indication the U.S. side has the same strategic clarity that Chinese leaders have going into these meetings. She said the White House needs to prioritize developing it fast. Now here is the dimension of the Beijing summit that is receiving almost no coverage, but that I think matters most for understanding where this whole situation leads. The U.S.-China summit was supposed to produce specific deliverables. China buying American soybeans at 25 million metric tons per year, China buying Boeing aircraft, China buying American liquefied natural gas. These aren't symbolic purchases. They're the economic proof points that allow Trump to tell American farmers, American manufacturers, and American energy workers that the confrontational approach is producing results they can see in their bank accounts. Iowa soybean farmers need those Chinese purchases. Boeing needs those aircraft orders. American LNG producers need those contracts. To get China to make those purchases, America would normally need to offer something in exchange. The most likely concession would be easing U.S. technology export controls on Chinese companies, specifically NVIDIA chips and semiconductor manufacturing equipment that China desperately needs for its AI and advanced manufacturing programs. China's 15th five-year plan, adopted formally in March 2026, explicitly identifies technological self-reliance as the central national priority. Breaking through the American semiconductor blockade is Beijing's single most important economic objective for this decade. Every time they sit down with Trump, that is what they are actually negotiating for, even when the agenda says soybeans. Scott Kennedy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies said the chances were high for a summit that superficially suggests progress, but that really just leaves things about where they've been for the last 4 months. He said Trump may want major Chinese commitments on Boeing and soybeans, but to get that, he may need to offer concessions on export controls. That is a trade that Beijing has been positioning for all year, and it becomes more achievable for China the weaker America's position going in. Here is where all the threads come together, because I've been doing this long enough to see when multiple pressure points are converging toward the same outcome, and that is what I'm watching right now. Trump goes to Beijing, whenever that happens, with the following cards in his hand. His tariff authority has been struck down by the Supreme Court. The replacement tariffs under Section 122 expired July 24th, unless new investigations are completed. His munitions inventory has been significantly depleted in the Middle East. His alliance relationships with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and the Gulf states have been strained by by a war launched without consultation. His domestic political position is being squeezed by $4 gas and a base that is starting to ask questions. And he needs a deal announcement he can sell as a win. She goes to Beijing, sitting across from him with the following position. China's trade surplus hit $1.2 trillion in 2025, the largest in history. The rare earth licensing architecture gives Beijing a dial it can tighten or loosen on American defense manufacturing at will. Chinese semiconductor exports grew 24.7% in 2025 despite everything. The Beidou satellite system proved its combat effectiveness over the Arabian Peninsula. CIPS is processing $128 billion a day outside American financial visibility. And the Atlantic Council said Beijing's core insight from everything that has happened since 2025 is exactly how much leverage China has over the American economy and the American president himself. That is not a negotiation between equals. That is a negotiation between a president who needs a deliverable and a strategic competitor who knows it. Now let me connect this directly to what it means for you, because this is the part that most coverage skips over. The Iran situation and the China summit are not separate stories. They are the same story running on two tracks simultaneously and converging toward the same household consequences. Track one is energy. Brent crude closed today around $104 after the 14% drop. That sounds like relief. But $104 is still 45% higher than it was on February 27th. The IEA released 400 million barrels from strategic stockpiles, the largest coordinated release in history, and oil is still $104. The IEA director said Monday, and I want you to hear these words carefully, that the stock release will help to comfort the markets, but this is not the solution. America's own strategic petroleum reserve has been partially drawn down. Goldman Sachs said before today's events that elevated prices could persist through 2027. Even with today's drop, we are nowhere near the pre-war baseline. And if the 5-day pause collapses, if Iran confirms there really are no negotiations happening, as their foreign ministry stated publicly today, then every penny of today's drop comes right back and then some. Track two is the trade war and the Beijing summit. Every month this situation drags on is a month that the Section 122 tariff authority burns down toward its July 24th expiration. Every week Trump spends managing an Iran crisis with no exit is a week of preparation time lost for the most important diplomatic meeting of his second term. Every additional concession America needs to make to get China to stabilize its behavior in the Iran situation, whether that's on Taiwan, on technology exports, on financial cooperation, is a concession that comes directly out of the negotiating margin Trump would otherwise have in Beijing. And every American household that is paying more for gas, more for groceries, more for heating, and watching their mortgage rate stay frozen because the Fed can't cut, is paying the accumulated cost of a strategic position that is being compressed on multiple fronts simultaneously. I want to stay on the mortgage rate point because I think it gets lost in the drama of oil prices and ultimatums. The Federal Reserve was widely expected to cut rates twice in 2026 before this war started. Those cuts would have meaningfully reduced pressure on variable rate mortgages, business loans, and the cost of carrying credit card debt. The median American household carrying a mortgage is directly affected by whether those cuts happen or not. They are not happening. The reason they are not happening is that core inflation, driven partly by the energy shock from a war that was launched without a plan to end it, is running above the Fed's 2% target. S&P Global said before today's developments that even the base case scenario of a short-lived disruption would keep the Fed on the sidelines. The more severe scenario, which is what today's events suggest we may still be heading toward, involves oil surging above $130 and prices not returning to pre-conflict levels until late 2026 or early 2027. If that scenario materializes, the rate cuts don't happen this year. They may not happen next year either. The homeowner sitting on a high mortgage rate, waiting for relief, is waiting for a resolution to a situation that the people managing it publicly cannot even agree on whether negotiations are actually happening. Let me tell you what I think is going to happen over the next 2 weeks, based on everything I've tracked over the past month. Trump's 5-day pause on strikes expires on Saturday. Iran says there are no negotiations, but Iran is also practically speaking, in a difficult position. They have leverage right now. Oil above $100 is hurting everyone, including countries Iran needs as partners. Qatar, which halted LNG production, is warning of an economic disaster. The Gulf states, even those angry at America for starting this war, are absorbing damage from Iranian drone and missile strikes on their infrastructure. The longer the strait stays closed, the more pressure accumulates from every direction, including from China, which, despite its shadow fleet and strategic reserves, is still paying more for the oil it needs. China's Middle East envoy said this week, "We all know who started this war," pointing at the U.S. and Israel. But Beijing also has a direct economic interest in the strait reopening. At some point, Iran's leverage peaks and starts working against them. The question is whether the next 5 days produce anything real, or whether Saturday arrives and Trump faces the same choice he faced Monday: escalate and risk $150 oil and a derivatives cascade, or back down again and watch American credibility in the region price itself down another notch. My read, based on tracking the pattern of the past 3 weeks, is that both sides are trying to find a face-saving exit that lets Trump declare victory and lets Iran claim it was never defeated. What that looks like in practice is probably a partial reopening of the strait combined with some kind of framework for nuclear talks that the administration can describe as historic, while Iran describes it as nothing binding. Neither side gets what it wanted when this started. Both sides get something they can live with politically. But even if that happens, even if a ceasefire framework emerges in the next week, the damage that has already been done to American strategic positioning does not reverse. The munitions inventory does not refill itself. The alliance relationships do not repair themselves with a press release. The Beijing summit does not become an exercise in American strength just because the Iran war ended. The trade deficit does not shrink because a deal photo was taken. And Goldman Sachs was telling us before any of this that a sustained oil price of $100 a barrel keeps U.S. inflation above 3% for the remainder of the year. Even if Brent settles around $90 after a ceasefire, which is the optimistic scenario, the food price increases from disrupted fertilizer supply chains are already baked in for the next harvest cycle. Those consequences are already in the pipeline, regardless of what happens with the 5-day pause. The IEA director said something on Monday that I keep coming back to. He said that if the strait stays closed, we will reach the point of no return for the global economy. He said that explicitly, on the record, on Monday. That is the head of the International Energy Agency describing a realistic, near-term scenario as the point of no return for the global economy. That statement was made on the same day that Iran's foreign ministry said there are no negotiations. On the same day that air raid sirens sounded in Bahrain after Trump announced productive talks. On the same day that oil swung 14% on the basis of a social media post and then clawed back half its losses because Iran said the post wasn't true. That is the situation as it actually exists today, not as it's being described in press releases and market commentary and cable news segments, but as the data shows it. A war with no exit plan that has lasted 3 weeks longer than promised. A Beijing summit delayed by a month under conditions that favor the other side. A tariff architecture struck down by the Supreme Court. A munitions stockpile burning down at exchange ratios that favor the attacker. A Federal Reserve frozen because inflation is being driven by decisions made in rooms most Americans never got to vote on. An energy market moving 14% on a single social media post because nobody can figure out whether the president who issued the ultimatum actually has the leverage to back it up. The cost of all of this is already on your gas station receipt, in your grocery cart, in your mortgage statement, and in the retirement account that dropped when the war started and only partially recovered when the 5-day pause was announced. The people making these decisions will not pay that cost. You are paying it right now. So I'll leave you with a real question, not a rhetorical one. Do you think the 5-day pause produces a genuine deal, or do you think Saturday arrives and we are back to where we were Sunday night with oil at $113 and an ultimatum that nobody knows whether it means anything? Drop your answer in the comments, because the answer to that question is going to determine what your gas bill looks like for the rest of this year. If this breakdown gave you something the evening news didn't, subscribe, because what we cover here is the sequence behind the headlines, and right now that sequence is moving faster than most people can track.